story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the Integration Society Research Forums, where we're deep now already in the process of our integration or integrative Metatheory 2.0 project, featuring folks exploring different models representing the kind of key aspects of a lot of the important big picture models that we're working with here and endeavoring to synthesize in the lead up to our symposium. Today, I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to introduce our own Nick Hedlund. Nick's the EIC, of course, the editor-in-chief of the Integration Journal, is co-director with me of research here at IAM, and also director of Eudaimonia Institute out in California, as well as teaching integral noetic sciences at California Institute for Human Science. Yeah, today Nick is going to be sharing with us sort of an overview of his visionary realism, which he's been developing for some time, including through his, I guess, doctoral dissertation, correct? Which I've read cover to cover, had printed out myself, and have gone through. Very, very wonderful, rich stuff. A synthesis of integral theory and critical realism, among other things. So, yeah, well, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Nick, and we can get started. So thanks so much, and looking forward to seeing what you got to share with us.
Thanks so much, Brendan. Yeah, wonderful to be here with all of you guys today. Thanks for showing up. So yeah, I want to just share a little bit about visionary realism, this framework that emerged out of this dialogue between integral theory and critical realism. And kind of like where this framework arose from, and what I think some of its core contributions are in terms of what it brings to the table of the ecology of integrative metatheories. So visionary realism, it's important, I think, to note that visionary realism for me didn't emerge just out of like, oh, I want to synthesize integral theory and critical realism. There's a deeper inquiry that drove this the whole time. The world situation was really I kind of came into this more from the angle of the ecological crisis, and that was something that really deeply impacted me from a young age, and kind of dedicated my life to trying to figure out what the heck is going on and what we can do about it to create a more sane and healthy and flourishing world. So that inquiry led me to eventually develop this idea of the metacrisis. So the idea of the metacrisis kind of co-arose with the development of visionary realism. So I was trying to understand the depth structure of our planetary crises, not only looking at the sort of symptom level of ecological, technological, political, economic crisis, but following this thread to understanding the deeper epistemic and existential and cultural and spiritual crises beneath them. So integral theory and critical realism entered into this inquiry because they seem to be two of the most comprehensive and sophisticated big picture attempts to understand reality. And so integral theory, offers this extraordinary developmental, perspectival and integrative architecture. Critical realism offers this powerful kind of depth ontology and philosophy of science, and a renewed account of truth, a revindication of truth, on a way to think about real causal structures, absence, and the developmental process of emancipation and evolution. So visionary realism emerged through bringing these two big picture visions into dialogue under the pressure of the metacrisis. What the core kind of question of my thesis was really about what are the intellectual resources that are needed to respond adequately to the metacrisis? What kind of architectures of thought do we need to begin to understand the metacrisis and then respond to it powerfully? So it's been basically this like sustained inquiry into the metacrisis. And visionary realism is really a philosophical form that's emerged as a root level response to the metacrisis in service of radical planetary flourishing.
Quick question, Nick. I know you've got some slides here. Just let me know whenever you want me to start sharing those so people can see those. So
yeah, you can go ahead and.
Okay, cool.
Put them up. Thanks. So one of the passages here that from Goethe that I really love is he says, every object well contemplated opens up a new organ of perception within us. So I almost take that sentence literally. So I've spent years contemplating the Metacrisis, not merely as an intellectual object, but as like a felt, lived, spiritual, existential reality. And I've like felt myself getting worked by that over time. And something in me has reorganized and developed in order to more adequately perceive the world situation. So the metacrisis has not presented itself only as a set of problems to be solved, but it also has presented itself as a revelatory pressure, a forcing function. It has presented itself as like a demand from reality itself, asking us to get clear about who and what we are and our place in the field of the cosmos. So it's opened, or at least has begun, the process of opening in me a new organ of perception, and many others are opening that organ of perception too, and contributing to an emergent collective wisdom about what it means to be alive on the planet at this time, and how do we respond with wisdom and care. So that's really, I think, the best way to understand what visionary realism is it's my attempt to articulate some of the first sketches or riffs of what reality discloses through this newly opened organ of perception that comes from deeply contemplating the metacrisis and trying to attune to the field of reality and what it's saying and what it's asking of us at this time. So, the view of the metacrisis that kind of comes into focus is not just, the typical words that people associate with the idea of crisis, of like emergency and breakdown, but really as an encounter and with reality that is disclosing more of reality, and as a kind of evolutionary metamorphosis. And part of what visionary realism contends is that it's actually the deeper absences and contradictions in our modes of consciousness, our worldview, that is itself like producing the symptomology of the metacrisis, and in the end driving us towards the actualization of more of our collective potential. So kind of one of the main ideas here is that the metacrisis is birthing a new human, a new worldview, and eventually a new world system. It's this forcing function for humanity's self-understanding and our worldview to evolve. It's asking us to rethink what reality is. It's asking us to rethink what the human being is, what nature is, what the sacred is. It's asking us to rethink what knowledge, truth, spirituality, and social transformation mean. So again, as Bhaskar would say, the world itself, or the Alethic truth, or the reality principle, is demanding rapid evolution and transformation. So it's demanding these new forms of culture and consciousness that are more adequate to the depth and complexity and sacredness of reality. And it's demanding that our noospheric creations, our worldviews, our institutions, our technologies, our social systems come into a deeper resonance with the field of reality and the sacred. And that notion there is basically what the meta principle that is kind of the primary animating synopsis of visionary realism, which is Alethic resonance. So I'll return to that in a little bit. But in many ways, this whole talk and visionary realism is kind of a scaffolding for that central kind of simplexified meta principle of Alethic resonance. How do we come into a resonance with reality? On all levels, personally in our thinking, and collectively in our ways of social organization. So I'll say a little bit more about the metacrisis and the role of metatheory, but I know that that's stuff that most of you guys are quite familiar with, so I'll move through that quickly, and then I'll lay out some of the architecture of visionary realism. And then I'll talk about, the synthesis that I arrived at and the ways in which it's kind of non-preservative and more than just an additive putting together of these two approaches. And yeah, so then I'll get into the core ideas of visionary realism, pandimensional realism, the new science of interiority, transcendental evolutionary realism, and finally Alethic resonance. Yeah, so the idea of the metacrisis, as all of you are, I'm sure, quite familiar, that it's more than just a heap of technological and ecological and political and economic crises. But there's something deeper underneath that. It's an powerful insight in itself to realize that those crises are deeply interrelated, and compounding and feeding back onto each other. The even more crucial insight is to see that there's a deeper network of causal roots, that could be construed as like absences, contradictions, and errors, and demi-realities in our worldviews that are generating them and intensifying them. So this worldview crisis is in many ways, could also be understood as an ontoepistemic crisis. It concerns what we take to be real, what we take knowledge to be, how we understand human beings' place in the order of the cosmos, and it concerns whether our forms of culture and civilization are actually in resonance with the real conditions of life. So we could call the metacrisis a worldview crisis, but we could, if we understand metatheory as the sort of formalized intellectual expression of worldviews, and in the history of culture have often been the like primary sort of seeds for the development of broader cultural worldviews, we could understand the metacrisis as kind of a metatheory crisis or a metatheory deficit. Our social systems run on worldviews, and our worldviews tend to emerge disproportionately out of these deeper metatheoretical assumptions forged by big picture thinkers. So many of the assumptions of our worldview are no longer adequate to the world that we inhabit. Visionary realism begins from this diagnosis, and looking at the metacrisis is not only a crisis within the world, it's a crisis of our way of worlding the world, understanding the world, and therefore relating to the world and bringing it into being on a social level. So it's a crisis in the deep code of culture, and so that's why I invested so many years of my life into like trying to really think through the foundations of our worldview. So this slide kind of gives an overview of the metacrisis as a meta system. I won't belabor this because I know you guys are very familiar with this kind of notion, but it is worth noting that like a depth stratified understanding of reality that we get from critical realism is very, very important to understand what the metacrisis is, because if we just look at the symptom and event level of the metacrisis, we kind of can miss the deeper generative forces that are undergirding the metacrisis. I've often used the metaphor of the Hydra from Greek mythology. Like we can keep trying to like do technical fixes and chop off one of the heads of the Hydra and watch 2 or 3 grow back. But the metacrisis notion here is trying to get to that deeper level of the real, where the deeper generative forces live. So beyond the visible symptoms, there are these systemic structures, and underneath those systemic structures are these worldview patterns, these ontological and epistemological and spiritual assumptions. And so visionary realism is trying to understand like these root causes again, and be in this process of kind of rethinking our fundamental assumptions about reality. So this brings me to visionary realism itself. The framework is not understood as like an isolated theory, but it's a sort of family of metatheoretical moves. It's one of the pieces of work that I did in my PhD thesis was really a metatheory of metatheory. So visionary realism in that sense is also a metatheory of metatheories. This is where the alpha, beta, gamma framework emerged. It kind of looked at all the existing literature on metatheory and saw that they were talking about very different facets of reality. So the alpha framework is about the philosophical metatheory and the deep kind of assumptions and presuppositions that inform the basic process of inquiry. The beta is the scientific metatheorizing and scanning across the horizon of all the various disciplines and trying to integrate them. And then the gamma is an overarching philosophical and scientific worldview. So it asks, what metatheory is, why it matters, and how different modes of metatheory relate to each other. So this includes also a metatheory of cultural transformation, as I've been articulating, and the claim that metatheory is actually kind of attempting to rewrite the deep code of culture. So it includes a metatheory of the metacrisis, as I've been articulating as well. And it's also a meta theory of spiritual science or science of interiority. And then there's also the kind of aspects that I've been developing more recently have to do with the psychology, so spirituality and psychology and interiority. And then more recently, I've been beginning to develop some thoughts about how visionary realism can also inform a meta theory of AI. This is very much in development, but the key question is around how our most powerful noospheric technologies can be brought into deeper resonance with reality, human development, and planetary flourishing. So, a common thread of all these is that visionary realism aims to forge like this meta theory gamma, this overarching worldview that's not merely a philosophical critique or a scientific synthesis. It's a formalized articulation of a worldview, an attempt to recode the deep structures of culture. So these are the three modes of meta theory: alpha, beta, gamma. So I saw that in many ways, integral theory is a meta theory beta. It focuses more on looking at the kind of findings of the special sciences and integrating them into an overarching understanding of reality, but it was not as strong on looking at the kind of philosophical ontology, the foundations of knowledge, the conditions for the possibility of science, etc. So in many ways, the attempt to bring critical realism and integral theory together was to forge a meta theory gamma that was both strong on philosophy and philosophical meta theorizing and scientific meta theorizing. And also, a key insight from critical realism there is that philosophy can sometimes be construed as a speculative process that's not really grounded in anything solid. But as Bhaskar articulates, drawing on the kind of Kantian stream of critical ontology and transcendental argumentation, philosophical transcendental philosophical arguments can be very systematic, retroductive, and produce apodictic knowledge, like demonstrably true knowledge that gets at the necessary conditions for the possibility of a given phenomenon. So it really starts to resemble the core architecture of empirical theorizing as well. So those two things can fit together in a way that's where both the philosophy and the science are procedurally rational, as Habermas would call it. They both have a transparent methodology that can be socially validated and checked and falsified. So one way of understanding how these things relate is that to have an overarching worldview, you need both a philosophical underlaboring and a scientific overlaboring. So this slide shows how, the alpha mode of meta theorizing relates to a philosophical underlaboring, and the scientific beta mode relates to this idea of scientific overlaboring. So philosophical underlaboring really clears the ground beneath the sciences, asks what reality must be like for science to be possible. And scientific overlaboring builds above the sciences, synthesizing those different findings from multiple disciplines. And then we can put those two things together, or really three, including just the scientific level of empirical theory together to create an overarching worldview. That's what visionary realism attempts to do. So it's working at the nexus of these different modes. And then crucially, it's like trying to really look at how those two modes of philosophy and science in the context of meta theory are interrelated and how they're feeding back on each other. And so we might develop new insights on the level of the philosophical underlaboring. And that actually has implications and places demands on the science and how we understand the science and how we interpret the science, how we make meaning out of the science. And likewise, new scientific findings that fill in the set of substantive content of the empirical world, which is vast. Though ultimately, those findings place demands on the philosophical foundations and demand that there's coherence across there. So that you get this idea of the circle of the sciences, or the twin screwing of science and philosophy, due to their syncategorigmatic nature. So moving to kind of critical realism. So what the process I went through was what I called hermeneutical dialectics. and also immanent critique. And so those are the kind of philosophical methods that I used in this work to develop visionary realism. So the hermeneutical dialectics is really looking at each approach, not from a view from nowhere, but from a situated approach within each theory. So looking at critical realism in light of integral theory, or from the vantage point of integral theory, and vice versa, looking at integral theory from the vantage point of critical realism, seeing what emerges. And then immanent critique is more about kind of looking at the internal structure and saying, like, we're not going to critique any system from the outside. We're going to look at its internal coherence and take its assumptions as given, and then kind of subject it to stress testing. See, well, how well does its own internal commitments hold up when under certain sort of stress tests? Immanent critiques are a really powerful mode of critique because you're not critiquing from the outside. You're saying, well, according to your own commitments and assumptions, this is a problem. So critical realism, in terms of, the first pass of this hermeneutical dialectics kind of looks at, well, what are the core contributions and strengths of each of these two approaches? And understood, through a realist backdrop that, what aspects of reality are very well illuminated through critical realism and through integral theory, and how do we put those two together? So the first pass is like, well, a core signature strength of critical realism is its depth ontology. It's this philosophical depth ontology came out of the British analytic tradition and the philosophy of science. And Bhaskar essentially took this question and saying, like, asking a transcendental question inspired by Kant again, but looking, not like what are the conditions in the mind for the possibility of knowledge or science, but what are the conditions in the world for the possibility of science, for experimental science. And so he ran a transcendental retroduction there and said, well, the world necessarily has to be structured in a certain way. It has to be changing. It has to have this kind of depth stratification, and there actually has to be a distinction between being and knowledge. Those two things can't be completely collapsed. So this core model of the depth ontology, where you have the stratification of the real, which can be understood as like kind of the essence of a reality. The actual, which is kind of how it produces actual events and expresses itself on a kind of more form level, and then the empirical, like how that's actually experienced, and that those three things can be under certain circumstances, they can be in phase and that they can be fully connected, but also the idea that the real continues to persist even if it's not actualized or experienced. So this is a really important element that critical realism brings. Its basic move, it also is to resist what Bhaskar calls the epistemic fallacy. The epistemic fallacy is, the reduction of being or ontology to knowing or epistemology. And Bhaskar says that this is one of the core kind of biases of Western thought that goes all the way back to Parmenides and Protagoras in ancient Greece, but is kind of deeply woven into Western thinking. So it's this tendency to treat questions of what exists as if they're only questions of what we can know, observe, or construct. And then you see a kind of radicalization of that philosophy in postmodernism of like, oh, well, it's all just this stream of constructed thinking and knowledge games and power games and language games. So critical realism insists on this intransitive dimension of reality. So reality exists and has a structure independent of our knowledge of it. And that, of course, that gets nuanced and complexified, that statement, like, and we have to make distinctions between like what's happening in the physiosphere or the world of nature, and then the sociosphere or the noosphere, the symbolically mediated, concept dependent world of human thought and society. And so reality exists and has a structure independent of our knowledge of it. Yes, that does hold even in the sociosphere, but then we have to add nuances there of the like, well, there's an existential intransitivity even to social and linguistic and intellectual forms. Once a form comes into being in the sociosphere, it's sort of laid down and etched into the, in a sense, the Akashic record of reality. And there's nothing in the subsequent moment that you can do to alter the fact that that was the reality that was laid down in that moment, even if it was, in a sense, a social construct. So there's an existential intransitivity to social objects, but there's a causal recursivity. And so that's an important nuance that critical realism gets at. So reality is not reducible to knowledge, but knowledge also in the sociosphere has an interrelated relationship to social reality. And we can distinguish that from, the dynamics of the natural world, which are, those are absolutely causally intransitive as well. So Bhaskar's classical stratification distinguishes these three levels. And again, the real is this domain of generative mechanisms, structures, powers, and tendencies. The actual is these events, whether they're observed or not, and the empirical is the domain of the experience of the events. So that matters enormously, for the metacrisis. Many of the most important causal forces, as I mentioned before, are not immediately visible. These generative mechanisms can be real, even when their effects are not constantly actualized. And this notion that constraints, contradictions, and absences, and even unrealized potentials can be causally significant. So critical realism has a causal criterion for reality. So anything that has causal efficaciousness is considered real, and that can be something that's true or false. And so Bhaskar has this notion of demi-realities, so that which is false but nonetheless causally efficacious and therefore real. So if we identify with some kind of false thought form, well, I can fly, so I'm going to believe that thought and then jump off my roof. Well, that has a real causal effect when I hit the ground, even though it was a completely false idea. So I think this is that the idea of demi-reality is an important contribution of critical realism as well. So critical realism contributes to visionary realism a way beyond this sort of flat in both this flat empiricism of modernity and the kind of radical constructivism of postmodernity. So it's against the flat empiricism, says reality is deeper than what is observed, and that's actually a transcendental condition or the possibility of science. So this isn't just a sort of opinion. It's like, no, you actually have to think this way if you want to have an intelligible and coherent philosophy of any kind. That's the claim anyway. It's potentially up for critique, but that's the claim. So it's also against this kind of strong or radical constructivism that says reality is created by our concepts. And again, there's a nuanced view there. And it's also against this sort of post-truth relativism. It reconstructs the possibility of judgmental rationality. It says there is truth and there is reality, and we can actually make judgments about what's more or less true or what is better or worse. And so it's revindicating. It gives this really powerful resources to try and revindicate the ideas of truth and reality in a cultural milieu in which those ideas have become, have until recently been seen as sort of passé to sophisticated intellectuals. Oh, haven't you read Foucault and Derrida? That seems naive, but Bhaskar shows, actually it's naive to argue that reality is constructed in that radical kind of way. So critical realism gives visionary realism a language for emancipation as well. It really gets into looking at social structures and the reality of social structures, and it suggests that we can understand and explain them, and we can diagnose social pathologies, and if they can be explained or diagnosed, they can also be transformed or healed. if they contain absences and contradictions, those will drive the pulse of freedom towards more, greater social emancipation. So critical realism gives visionary realism its philosophical depth, and there's a lot more I could say. These are just kind of the highlights. But on its own, critical realism, when I started to look at critical realism in light of integral theory, it doesn't really have a great understanding of the kind of all the different perspectives on reality, a sort of taxonomy of epistemic structures. It tended to see things in a pretty simplistic way from an epistemic point of view relative to integral theory, that's saying, well, there are all these developmental structures that are helping to disclose reality, and there's different types and there's different states, and all of that seemed to be pretty much missing in critical realism. And also there seemed to be a kind of inadequate epistemology there, because well, one of critical realism's core criterion for good philosophy is internal coherence, self-reflexivity, can the philosophy account for itself? And what I started to see was that critical realism was this very, very complex, very cognitively developed sort of perspective, some teal turquoise sort of perspective, and yet it didn't really have any kind of account of how it could sustain its own view of reality. And so that's where integral theory came in and said, okay, we can really fill out this picture and complexify the story that critical realism articulates. And also there's, perhaps a tendency in critical realism to maybe discount some of the insights of the postmodernists to some extent. And it can have a little bit of a modernist hangover vibe to it. And so by bringing integral theory, we can also do an even greater job of kind of doing justice to, the moments of truth and virtue in the postmodern critiques. So integral theory brings in this incredible taxonomy of developmental and epistemic structures. In Wilber's integral psychology, which I think is arguably the most developed aspect of integral theory, he scans across the horizon of over 100 developmental models, some of which are, highly scientific, some are kind of more spiritual and esoteric, but nonetheless comes up with a meta theory of how all these structures fit together. Has originally his theory of the fulcrums, and then later the developmental altitudes, kind of relating them all and putting them all together. And this just seems like an absolutely indispensable contribution. And while you find this in the neo-Piagetian streams of developmental psychology, I think it's an incredible contribution that Wilber has offered to kind of look at many of these approaches and try and understand how they fit together. So it's a great strength that it gives us this integrative grammar for organizing multiple dimensions of reality and knowledge. And it also distinguishes between interiors and exteriors, individuals and collectives, obviously, levels, lines, states, types, perspectives, all this showing that human beings do not simply hold different opinions, they inhabit different developmental structures of sense making and meaning making. And this is absolutely crucial for understanding the metacrisis. For one thing, I argue that the metacrisis is itself a metasystem, and therefore to adequately disclose the metasystem that the metacrisis is, one has to inhabit a metasystematic cognitive structure to be able to see the ways the systems are interrelating, probably at a minimum. And that's one of the notions that visionary realism also articulates, is that when we're looking at a ontological phenomenon or object that is at a given level of complexity, say, it is a metasystem. If we don't have a metasystem capacity or metasystematic cognitive epistemic capacity, we're going to get what's called a vertically reductive demi-reality. So where our construal of reality is inadequate to the complexity of reality, and therefore it's reductive in this vertical way, and therefore it's false. It's a demi-reality that is nonetheless causally efficacious, because we walk around as if the world wasn't a complex metasystem, when it actually is, and that has real consequences. So integral theory gives visionary realism something critical realism does not adequately provide. It gives us all this understanding of the complexity of how we construct knowledge and how that gets developed, and it gives us the scaffolding. Critical realists seem to, often what's called the cognitive maturity fallacy is like this idea that you could just anyone could just pick up a Bhaskar book and get into it and then go out and start a social revolution. But in fact, there's all kinds of developmental scaffolding and modes of education and whatnot that need to be in place before someone can even disclose the objects that Bhaskar is trying to get at. But nonetheless, integral theory, the more I looked at it, seemed to have this deep philosophical liability. It took up this post-metaphysical and enactivist formulation, and I felt like it could slide into this kind of neo-Kantian form of irrealism or post-Kantian irrealism that commits, again, the epistemic fallacy, especially in Wilber 5, where Wilber is saying that, the reality of any given object is contingent on the epistemic structures and methods that the subject uses to enact that reality. So it's not really giving any ontological purchase to the thing, independent of our structures and methods of knowing. And that for me went too far and feels like it's still stuck in what the speculative realists call correlationism, which is akin to the epistemic crisis. And that in many ways has a lot to do with the kind of crux, the root structural crux of the metacrisis, like this ways that we feel like the human is split off from the world, alienated from the world. Ontology and epistemology, there's a fissure there. There's this Kantian gap where we can't really touch the thing in itself, and all we can experience is the phenomenal world, and we're not really woven into the fabric of reality. And these are deep philosophical problems that, as Bhaskar does an amazing job of articulating, they trickle down more and more and become psychological problems, sociological problems, ecological problems. So it's very hard to buttress an account of truth and reality if you're caught in this epistemic fallacy. If reality is too tightly bound to perspective, it becomes difficult to reconstruct any kind of strong notion of reality contact. It becomes difficult to say why one worldview is more adequate than another. Becomes difficult to ground judgmental rationality in a post-truth world. And that seems pretty obvious to me that that's a crucial move, that we, in some sophisticated way that takes into account our radical powers to construct and construe the world, to return to this notion that there is a truth, that there is a reality that's not something that we can just make up with, or deal with, vis-a-vis alternative facts and so on. So visionary realism takes integral theory seriously in this way, but it doesn't preserve it unchanged. So when you see, one way of looking at the hermeneutical dialectics is scanning across each of these theories and trying to identify where are the contradictions, where are the absences. In integral theory, I identified that there is a deep performative self-contradiction related to its commitment to its enactivism and post-metaphysical position. And critical realism, looking at that, would say, there's actually a transcendental refutation there. And what a transcendental refutation is pointing to is saying that that account's actually not consistent with a coherent account of what science is and how knowledge is actually produced, and therefore it's unintelligible. So integral theory doesn't really have a strong philosophical ontology. But it has this brilliant sort of scientific meta-theorizing approach and taxonomy of epistemic structures. So integral theory had to basically get real, had to be realigned with a realist ontology. And so the depth ontology of critical realism coming in, and then, as I was saying earlier, when you change the fundamental philosophical ontology, that has implications, like transformative implications across the metatheory beta or scientific theorizing that a given metatheory argues for. And so there's a lot of that had to be rethought, say, in terms of like the quadrants of integral theory, which I'll get to. And then also critical realism had to be developmentally transfigured and needed its own epistemological account of itself to be enriched by the resources that integral theory is offering. So originally I called it a critical realist integral theory, but as I got deeper into the kind of negative dialectics of the process, the negative transfiguration, the places where there were actual incommensurabilities and contradictions between the two, and they had to be sort of transfigured or alchemized. I realized that like what comes out the other end is like an emergent thing, and that's why I shifted the name Visionary Realism. So the hermeneutical dialectics and the eminent critique, we talked about that. So what starts to come out of this non-preservative synthesis that really works out the implications of these contradictions and absences is what I called pandimensional realism. So looking at all the dimensions of reality, the four quadrants in integral speak, but saying, look, all these dimensions are actually real, and there's a depth stratification that's happening and across all those levels. And I think there's some misunderstandings in the early dialogues, associating realism with materialism, and kind of collapsing those two ideas, and going like, oh, there's idealism in the left-hand quadrants and materialism / realism in the right-hand quadrants, and these realist guys are trying to reduce everything to the right-hand quadrants. And that was just a very coarse interpretation that some of the folks in the space were articulating. But of course, that pointed to the need to really understand what we mean by the terms, like what is the referent behind the term, because when you hear the word object from an integral perspective and you throw that immediately in the right-hand quadrants, you're going to miss the point, because critical realism uses the word object in a more integral way. An object meaning just any reality, right? And the objective structure of any given phenomenon in the interior or exterior domains. So this idea of pandimensional realism, it's a bit of a Baroque slide here, but you can see that there are certain aspects of reality that are disclosed empirically, certain aspects that are beyond the empirical that are disclosed through transcendental methods. And we could see that in any given quadrant, there's like a real object that may or may not actualize in terms of certain events, and those events can be interior or exterior, and those events may or may not be experienced. So one of the moves there in terms of like cohering the metatheory alpha with the metatheory beta for integral theory was, okay, we shifted the metatheory alpha to a more realist ontology. That demanded that we rethink what the quadrants are. So this idea that the interior quadrants are subjective and the exterior quadrants are objective, like I critiqued that and drew that into question and said, well, what do we really mean by that, and how does that work? And there's a lot I can unpack about that, but in a sense, what I am getting at there is that the idea that it's all real, interior and exterior, and that subjective and objective, while subjectivity is a primordial mode of existence in a sense, I think it's more useful to think about it in terms of like a kind of epistemic claim. So on the level of knowledge, subjectivity has to do with knowledge. Subjectivity is the status of our knowledge. Objectivity is also like a claim about a certain kind of knowledge. And so if we really look at what we mean by something being objective in the exterior world and the interior world, we can see that really there's just a certain set of like validity principles there that it has to satisfy for it to be considered objective, and that there is really nothing about it having a material structure that gives it a leg up in terms of its purchase on objectivity. So that really shifts how we think about things. And it has to have epistemic reliability. It has to have ontological intransitivity, and it has to have epistemic validity, and we can break that down. But essentially what we're saying is that, like, look, we think just because an exterior object, like there's almost like a myth of the given kind of thing, where it's like, oh, well, yeah, the tree's just there because it's kind of obvious. We have these rulers and clocks, and therefore we know that it's there. But all that's really doing, the rulers and clocks are just a kind of scaffolding for a kind of inter-individual epistemic hermeneutic reliability. So what's a fancy way of saying, we both looked at the thing and we can see the reality, and we can have a coherent understanding and develop a tight, systematic, rigorous intersubjective consensus that we're both seeing some stable structure about reality that goes beyond our subjective projections. Like there's something, and I think the Neo-Piagetan structures are a great example of that. Like that's not, a metasystematic cognitive structure is not just something that I'm projecting. It's there's an objective reality there, objectively real knowledge about an interior reality that has causal purchase on the way we construe and understand and relate to reality. So that feels like a really important corrective that visionary realism makes. And it also opens up the possibility of a new science of interiority. In this kind of enlightenment gap, we have tended to understand, okay, there's things that we can know objectively, and we've coupled that with exteriority and materiality. And then and subjectivity is this kind of black box, and we can just sort of speculate about it. And we have the social sciences are just kind of a heap of speculative notions that have to do with social realities, interior realities. And so the argument that I make is that actually there are some of social and human sciences that are actually getting at objective structures of interiority, and some that are more just kind of whatever ethnographic accounts that are useful on a micro level, but not necessarily getting at like deep objective structures of reality. So pandimensional realism underlabors for a new kind of science, a science of consciousness that's not physicalist, a science of culture that's not merely constructivist, a science of spiritual experience that's not merely sort of confessional, and a science of interiority that actually could be rigorous, pluralist, realist, and that can open up a whole new world of like actually understanding. And this is a lot of the work that we're also trying to do at the Institute of Applied Metatheory, of trying to understand, like, say with the Cultural Complexity Index or the Worldview Studies Initiative, understanding what are these real structures of the interior world, and appreciating that they are not just constructs, and that they have real causal powers. So, we can study interiority through first person modes, through second person modes, through third person modes. And by bringing together critical realism and integral theory, we can also combine Bhaskar's like secular spirituality that roots its understanding of non-dual spiritual phenomena in transcendental arguments, with Wilber's idea of a deep empiricism, contemplative phenomenology that is a kind of mystical empiricism that can also be taken seriously as the kind of empirical element to a science of interiority. And I think this has big implications for the metacrisis. And as we start to see that interiority is not just a sort of subjective, intersubjective, constructivist black box, but there's really real structures that are happening there, and that starts to get illuminated. I think that's going to do much for the expansion of our worldview and our capacity to support ourselves as a collective to develop a healthier relationship to our interiors and unfolding our potentials more effectively. So then the other piece that I did in Visionary Realism was like, okay, so Bhaskar looked at what are the conditions in the world for the possibility of experimental science. But then what I did was I came in and looked at, well, what are the conditions for Bhaskar looking at the conditions for the possibility of science? And so it's kind of a long and complex argument there, but essentially what I argued there is that Bhaskar's formulations of his philosophy of science presuppose a metasystematic cognitive structure, and therefore that metasystematic cognitive structure plugs into the model of hierarchical complexity and the lectical system and etc. And then you can retroduce like all the prior structures were necessary conditions for the emergence of a metasystematic cognition, and that goes all the way down the stack into even biological evolution, as Commons articulates. And so I'm basically making an argument that development or cognitive development or evolution is something that's built into the very fabric of the cosmos, and we can transcendentally retroduce that. So it's not, so then again, there's a kind of mutual buttressing of the scientific findings of developmental psychology, and also this philosophical argument that's saying, no, evolution is built into the fabric of the cosmos. And so that's what I'm trying to get at with this idea of transcendental evolutionary realism. So critical realism gets developmentally transformed. And so Bhaskar's analysis of experimental science, really shows this. So that's another piece of visionary realism, and so this gives us a realist interpretation of development. Development is driven by the pressure of reality, and sometimes Piaget is sometimes talked about as a constructivist, which is I think a very confused notion. I think if you read Piaget carefully, it's very clear that it's the structure of reality, and that's the driver of the process development, the complexity of reality, and that as epistemic subjects, we're interfacing with those realities and attempting to equilibrate the world, the structure of the world, with our worldview, and that's actually the driver of development. And we can reread that with Bhaskar's metaphysics of dialectic, say, well, it's actually whatever's absent in our worldview that's present in the structure of reality. That absence is actually a generative force that's going to put pressure on our system to develop. And we can lean into that consciously in visionary realism by going, well, the more we can try and have humility and listen to what reality and contemplate what reality is expressing, that we're probably going to have a more harmonious and efficient process of assimilating and equilibrating between reality, between world and worldview. So always attempting for this deeper attunement and resonance. So this idea of like one of the parts, the crux of the issue, the heart of the matter here, the belly of the Hydra beast, in a sense, has to do with closing this Kantian chasm. And in the modern world, there's this wound that sort of splits being from knowing, human from the world or from nature, fact from value, split between the human and the sacred. All of that we can think of together as kind of like the enlightenment gap in Greg Henrique's terminology. And that's really the key thing, I think, to address, actually, to have a coherent account of how to heal that split. So visionary realism tries to close that chasm and heal that split without collapsing the difference. And this is one of the key things, is that I think there's an intuition in the metamodern integrative space that, like, hey, look, ontology and epistemology are not separate. They can't be split apart. And so some approaches try and like implode them or collapse the distinction, but that doesn't really work either. And I think integral theory in its phase 5 formulation kind of does that. It kind of implodes the distinction between ontology and epistemology, but that doesn't actually solve the problem. It just kind of like radicalizes it. So this idea in visionary realism of a complex asymmetrical unity between ontology and epistemology, where being contains knowing, or constellationally contains or envelops or transcends and includes knowing, so that knowing is a subset of the world of being. And the other aspect of that is, like, we can think of this in terms of like then what we call nature, or the natural world. In visionary realism, we call that nature one. And then the human self-reflexive expression, symbolically mediated expression of nature, is what we call nature two, or second nature. and that those two things are not separate either. And we have to have a way of understanding the continuity, the unity between humanity and nature, nature one, nature two, but at the same time honoring the distinction, and figuring out how those two things relate in a coherent way. And this for me is really important, that we see ourselves as nature. Our Sean Kelly here has wonderfully contributed this idea of like the what is it, Sean? The Gaia Anthropocene?
Gaia Anthropocene, yeah.
Right, exactly. And this is a beautiful resonant notion along these lines, that like, yes, there's this human element, but we're a part of this larger sphere of nature one, this Gaia, and that understanding that and integrating that into our worldview and ways of being in the world is absolutely crucial if we're going to make it through this crucible of the metacrisis in a good way. So nature one is the kind of the creativity of nature that produced the human. It's the more than human reality that preceded us. It's the art, it's first nature. It's not constructed by us. And this is a, kind of a hubris that's built into some of our culture that, arguably has roots back to certain interpretations of Kant that became kind of culturally sedimented and even informed kind of new age interpretations of what we create our own reality in this kind of hubristic thinking. So the nature one's not constructed by us. It's this generative field out of which we emerged. And nature two is this noospheric creativity. That's the world that's mediated by meaning, concepts, self-reflexivity, institutions, technologies, cultures, social forms. And it's true that all those things are constructed. Like, we do construct noospheric reality. Once it's laid down again, it has its own reality that needs to be honored as existentially intransitive. So it's concept dependent, but there's this recursivity, and it's also historically contingent, right? And so the meanings that we make are contingent on all kinds of structures, linguistic structures, historical structures, psychological structures, etc. But the concept dependent doesn't mean it's unreal. The social forms are real. Noospheric forms are real. Institutions, technologies, disciplines, worldviews, they can all possess real causal powers. And again, they have this existential intransitivity. So this idea that nature too is both real and dependent, it's kind of this notion that we're trying to come to terms with the fact that we have been given this kind of radical, like, Promethean powers of logos and the capacity to create these like symbolic worlds, and how profound that is. It's understandable that we maybe get a little carried away with that, and these kind of hubristic self-understandings of thinking ourselves as like kind of gods, and it is like a godlike capacity that's been given to us. But that godlike capacity, so we kind of can sound whatever note we want into the field of the noosphere, right? But that is happening within this sort of symphonic backdrop of the sphere of nature one and the cosmos. It's like it's not happening in a vacuum. And so whatever notes we sound can either be more or less resonant or dissonant with the broader like principles and boundary conditions and structural realities of the broader sphere of nature one and the cosmos, right? And so this brings us to kind of this idea of alethic resonance. So our noospheric creations like must like come into more and more alethic resonance with nature one, so that our first nature is actually coherent with second nature. The world that we create is becoming coherent with the world that created us. And there's actually like a resonance loop that closes that circuit, and we actually feel rewoven into the fabric of the universe, such that we are like expressions of this deeper reality. And this is a lot of what's coming through in like the big history space of like that we are the cosmos, becoming aware of itself, learning how to express itself, and hopefully express itself in ways that are coherent with the wholeness of our being from across the stack from physiosphere to biosphere to zoosphere to noosphere. So our technologies are fundamentally our worldview has to come into alethic resonance with reality and with the sacred, with nature one. And then the institutional forms, the technological forms that we create from our worldview, and there's never a technology or institution that isn't an instantiation of a worldview. Those must be in resonance with life, with reality, with the sacred, with the principles and boundary conditions of nature one. Our worldviews have to actually express that, and then our worldviews become the blueprint or the template from which we create sociospheric forms that are actually in resonance with that. And so this is like a powerful way of like trying to address the enlightenment gap, trying to close the gap between mind and matter, between nature and culture, between scientific knowledge and human meaning. So visionary realism proposes that the gap can be closed by recognizing that knowing is inside being in this complex asymmetrical way. There's different kinds of unity. It's an asymmetrical unity where there's a unilateral dependence. So Bhaskar calls this the ecological asymmetry. Like we are dependent on nature one for our existence. Nature one's not dependent on us as humans for its existence. And so that also demands a certain kind of like reverence and respect, that we actually pay attention to the boundary conditions. And for example, don't create an economic system whose fundamental principles of like infinite growth and extractive capitalist consumption are in radical and obvious contradiction to the boundary conditions of a finite earth with a finite amount of natural capital. So that's a good example of alethic dissonance in our neoclassical economic system. So alethic resonance, it's this dynamic attunement between our knowledge, agency, culture, artifacts on the one hand, and the truth structures and emancipatory potentials of reality on the other. It's not a correspondence theory of truth. It's actually an expressive referential theory of truth, so that if every object well contemplated opens a new organ of perception within us. So if we really contemplate something and we are getting at the referent, the thing, the reality of the thing, then we can become a resonator or a vector for that thing to express itself noospherically. And it's not that we're standing apart from the thing, that we are actually becoming an expression of the thing, and in this complex asymmetrical unity. It's participatory, it's processual, and it's also pluralist. So the idea of alethic truth or alethic resonance, well, alethic resonance kind of goes beyond alethic truth and saying that, like, look, there's a whole set of, like, in music, there's the idea of the harmonic series, all these harmonies. So there's a core natural frequency or note, and then there's all these like almost infinite set of like harmonics, ways that we can express in ways that are like harmonic or harmonically resonant to that structure of truth. So it's not just about a simple definitional notion, which is more about like alethic truth, like what is the definitional structure that undergirds, the chemistry structure that undergirds the green emerald, right? That's the alethic truth. But there's like so many artistic and aesthetic and spiritual modes that we could express and create social forms that are in resonance with that core truth structure. But all that's to say, visionary realism kind of is this. I love this idea of alethic resonance because it builds on like 7 other principles in visionary realism. And it's actually a meta principle that's dependent on all the others. And there's this simplexification or this second simplicity about alethic resonance that's saying like, look, this is the core kind of principle here. And it's also has this kind of like octave resonance that I would argue like, Gebser talks about, kind of how the integral in some ways kind of recapitulates some of the early worldview structures at a higher octave. And Tyson Yonkaporta has argued that like the essence of indigenous thinking, the core animating principle of indigenous worldviews is this idea of that if you don't move with the land will move you. So this is kind of a more localized maybe expression of a very resonant principle of that if you don't move with reality will move you. And we can try and act from demi-real worldviews, but eventually the contradictions and absences in our worldview will feed back to us in the form of, hey, a metacrisis, right? Until we start to wake up. and see the deeper picture of what's here and how can we live in a harmonic resonance with reality? How can society be an expression of that deeper wisdom? And all this is it's a embodied and heartful and spiritual process of trying to listen and attune to reality. And this is just kind of an intellectual scaffolding that's trying to support that process. So I guess I'll leave it at that and open it up for questions. Thank you so much.
I guess I'll ask a short one, if I may. Or just make a comment, which is especially I thank you very much for this really involved talk. And I like much of it, and especially liked the end, the chasm. And I just wanted to mention here the role of evolutionary epistemology, because after all that, so if nature one is nature, and nature two, epistemology and knowledge. So, for example, I mean, Konrad Lorenz wrote a famous essay like 100 years ago called Kant's A priori and in light of modern biology. And so the narrower dark ellipse, your epistemology ellipse, that's where Kant's transcendental conditions are. They're in that ellipse. Well, it so happens that since the late 19th century, the larger ellipse, the larger context nature, we know that it evolves. And in particular, when it evolves living things, they themselves evolve under natural selection, which then edits the cognitive systems of the animals it produces. And Donald Campbell became the most famous person associated with evolutionary epistemology. But Lorenz's essay is so beautiful because people were objecting, well, what does that mean? You think because we're evolved, everything we believe is right and our knowledge is always true and our cognitive capacities are always accurate. He said, no, not at all. The horse's hoof evolved to deal with the step. And it does a pretty good job most of the time, or else the horse wouldn't exist. But it stumbles. It stumbles. And if you take it into weirder environments, it will stumble more. And our cognitive system, likewise, is built for certain things. Now, we're kind of special because our cognitive system includes this bizarre thing called language, which allows us to talk and communicate. But anyway, it grasps part of the real environment. And in our case, it stumbles. And in our case, it's also capable of increasing its grasp on the real environment. Anyway, that was Lorenz. But thank you.
That's powerful. Thank you. Yeah, I'll have to look into those folks in more depth. But thank you for that, Larry. Brendan.
Well, yeah, picking up on that, and thanks for mentioning that, Larry. I think Donald Campbell, evolutionary epistemology, super important here. But it raises actually a really interesting question because, one way of knowing that you're in alethic resonance with reality is by these kinds of evolutionary adaptations. If you're still around, if you're being, in a sense, evolutionary successful, you're like, oh, well, I must be in alethic resonance with reality, right? But when you live in demi-realities, this poses a real challenge because to be adaptive in a demi-reality actually means being out of alethic resonance with reality, but conforming to these social noospheric expectations of, let's say, that exploitative and extractive neoliberal capitalism or that sort of thing, right? So that raises kind of a bigger problem, right? Of sort of like if it's not just through adaptation, because actually you can be more alethically attuned and then less adaptive in your demi-real context. So then what are the arbitrating, adjudicating factors for a kind of meta fitness in that sense, if that question makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think we all probably feel that tension to some extent in our own lives, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it's I don't have any brilliant easy answers other than you're kind of trying to bootstrap off the demi-real systems in ways that you are ultimately contributing to more Alethic resonance. And so, Robert Hunter, a great lyricist of the Grateful Dead, has a line that says, "Stoke the fires of paradise with coals from hell to start." Or how do you kind of deploy, a pathological logic in ways that are like artfully, ultimately leading to more flourishing, and how do you pay the bills and also contribute to something that's good?
Using the master's
But
tools
yeah,
to
those are
deconstruct the
great
house.
questions, and I think that's a big part of the bind that so many of us find ourselves in. Being subject to these demi-real pathological systems, and simultaneously trying to find the pathway to flourishing. It's creating a lot of tension and pressure.
Yeah, and one last observation there, I guess, is that eventually reality does catch up with demi-realities. So these are temporary adaptive contexts, but eventually, when you've cut down the last forest, when you've done whatever, then reality comes roaring back, and we're experiencing that with the Metacrisis. So it's a temporary zone of maladaptive, adaptive kind of constraints that are informing a sense of what is
Yeah,
true.
yeah, and you have to kind of have be working on multiple kind of like horizons at the same time, like say with antibiotics or whatever. It's like, yeah, it's been really successful to adapt in a certain way, but like now scientists are saying that like we maybe have like 15 to 20 years before all antibiotics will be unhelpful at all. So it's like, okay, you need to like operate within that system, and then at the same time have a strategy for like on this longer term time horizon of like, what does a world without antibiotics look like?
Yeah, thanks.
Let's go to Lynn.
Yeah, I mean, that was just absolutely wonderful, Nick. I mean, just so clear, fantastic. I just want to say that. I also noticed in this idea of alethic resonance, which I love, that it could be, I suppose, sold to different levels of development. Like at one level, don't mess with Mother Nature. At another level, align thy will with my will. And then the idea modern of, it has to be effective and efficient. And if it's not, it's going to get, there'll be a wrench in the works. And I mean, it just seems to span such a beautiful range of possibilities. So yeah, thank you. That's just gorgeous.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a good point. It definitely, that's one thing that I was love about it, and was in some ways surprised that, oh wow, it really does cut across all these domains. And yeah, thanks, Lynn. Mark.
Nick, hi. Thanks so much for that presentation. Really, really wonderful. Can I just push on this issue of, with critical realism? I think Bhaskar had this view of social causation, which really it helped him to develop the sense of the priority of ontology. And do you think that sort of the concept of worldview as this causally efficacious sort of vision, isn't that exactly what the epistemic fallacy is?
No.
So chasing after these causally efficacious, well, isn't that exactly what he developed his theory of social activity, for example, which is very Marxist. It's very, his supervisor, his PhD, was Rom Hare, who had this very Marxist notion of materialist dialectical sort of causal efficaciousness of the social. So it wasn't atomistic materiality, but it was more, practice and embodied in activity, this holistic notion of sensuous human activity, as Marx calls it, And so when we try to find the causal worldview, that's the problem. Isn't that exactly what what the epistemic fallacy is?
It's a great comment, Mark. I don't think so. I don't think that's what the epistemic fallacy is pointing to, and I think there's a lot of, well, there's a lot of nuances here, and that's part of what's difficult about all of this. But I would say, I mean, Bhaskar is often misinterpreted, I would say, as a kind of materialist, Marxist kind of figure. But, I think folks haven't really integrated, like, he wrote a whole essay on the causal efficacy of ideas. Um, and uh, and so I think he didn't draw it out and kind of elaborate as much. And that's part of what the project of visionary realism has been to do, is to sort of elaborate on that line of thinking of like, okay, if ideas are causally efficacious and real, then systems of ideas that articulate an ontology, epistemology, axiology, and praxeology, a worldview, uh, these are obviously kind of causally efficacious as well, but not in a way that is contradicting that in the um, in the physiosphere and the biosphere. There's both the um, existential and causal intransitivity that's kind of pretty much absolute, and then in the sociosphere there's a existential intransitivity, so that uh, that's grounding this notion that, like, hey, the worldview is not just completely constructing reality. Like, there is one aspect of it where there's a causal recursion that's happening. So it's laying down, like bringing certain social forms into being and having real causal effects in the world that are then etched into the kind of akashic fabric of things, and that has to be respected as that is independent of my worldview. What happened, what's being laid down in this moment, is independent of what my worldview is
Yeah.
constructing in the next moment, right? So it's
Well,
there's a
if that's
process.
the case, if that's the case, maybe worldview is the wrong word.
Hmm.
Maybe because if we, that Weltanschauung is the Kantian, it comes from the Kantian,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And that is so um, associated with a Kantian sort of, uh, view of um, this subjective placement of categories onto the world in which we live, that it's got all these connotations of this very subjective and intersubjective inference onto the world. Maybe there's a better term, maybe there's a better, I like in your
Too late. We've
diagram.
already staked our whole career on our identities around this idea of worldview. So it's too late. Sorry, Mark. No,
Well, I think
it's
your
a, it's a
diagram,
good it's a good inquiry. I appreciate what you're
yeah,
saying. Yeah.
your diagram is pointing to a different, you know, sort of the framing of this dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Well,
think there's probably
let's talk
better
let's
terms for
talk more about that sometime. I think that's a really interesting point, and I think ultimately trying to kind of Bhaskar and Kant kind of bring these two different pieces that I think ultimately connect, and then there's like this kind of there's a kind of feedback loop that's happening there, and neither of those poles can be collapsed or imploded into each other, and
yeah.
it's it's not super easy to articulate, but
Thanks, Nick.
thank you.
Cool.
There were some thoughts that Mark raised that I think are pretty clearly avoided in terms of collapsing that into the epistemic fallacy. If you appreciate that worldviews are causal structures in multiple ways, including the ways they get historicized and externalized and get put into material culture. So once a worldview is operating in a particular way, it leaves not only a kind of behavioral trail behind it, or immediately in its kind of wake of individual action, but also it gets externalized into objects that then wind up shaping culture and the enculturation process itself. And so that feedback loop that Nick mentioned is there. Now, you can have worldviews that are rooted in demi-realities in various ways, and that might be the closest thing you could say to the epistemic fallacy there, that these ideas are causally efficacious, but they're also, constructed or something. But I think there's a lot you could tease out in terms of like, well, are they running fully afoul of a kind of, evolutionary epistemology, the way that Larry mentioned? Well, no, if they were, then people wouldn't be able to be living and reproducing that culture. But then there's also the developmental aspect in which those those demi-realities have the capacity to be corrected over time through learning processes in culture. And so it's not just to say that we construct reality and then we see it out in the world. It's a much more complex, I think, interrelated set of phenomena in terms of people get enculturated into societies with ideas. So those are causally efficacious. Their behavior is causally efficacious. They externalize their worldviews into various material products, which then have causal efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. And so just trying to, collapse all that to, well, that's the epistemic fallacy. It's a much more kind of recursively complex, interrelated set of feedback cycles that are going over time in history. And the work that Nick and I are doing on the worldview front also is important because it makes very explicit what we mean by worldview, what the aspects are, uses it as a construct in a particular way to clarify that in important ways. So it's not just sort of a loose thing. And I mean, in a very pedantic sense, I'd also just say that I don't see so much the Kantian aspect in the Weltanschauung thing. I mean, Kant coined the term, but mostly it's actually kind of a Hegelian thing. If anything, it's kind of idealistic in the sense of, how it gets picked up. But then, of course, it gets historically materialized by Marxist thinkers and others. So I think it actually does a lot of work. One of the things that we're trying to do is sift through that vast literature to try to clarify and offer a kind of coherent account of this in light of all of the worldview studies literature, philosophy of worldview, etc. So anyway, I just had a lot of thoughts related to that, but yeah.
Great. And just real quick, I would say I think sometimes I can maybe overemphasize this sort of chain of causality in a kind of diachronic mapping of things, of like, worldviews like create these artifacts of social institutions and technologies and stuff, and then underemphasize the fact, and then once you create those institutions and technologies, once you design those things, then they design us. And then that's the Marxist kind of emphasis there, is like the system is actually entraining consciousness and culture, and they're both true. It's just that the flat construal synchronically of them being kind of on equal footing misses the kind of like what actually generated the systems and institutions and technologies. So, Donita, hi.
Hi. I don't know if we have time. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, especially because you have such a grasp of the landscape like you just presented. And I think the opportunity is, what do we know now that Bhaskar had no access to? This is a really interesting question. And somehow this is, I'm not going to use Greg's terms, but somehow this implies his work and also the question that Mark asked. And that is, so when Bhaskar, I remember at the symposium, the thing that really stunned me was Bhaskar's notion of causally effective illusions, right? You could be wrong and they have causal powers. And at the time, I think we were talking mostly about human systems and the human propensity to be lost in the demi-real and stuff. But if we look at Greg's work, and this thing that you reminded of us, is that the human world is ultimately asymmetrically or intransitive to, I mean, the opposite to nature one. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I think if we look now at recent advances in cognitive science, the slow bench scientists like Michael Levin, and not like so much Vervaeke type of philosophical science, there's something interesting that is happening, and that is when we say something has causal powers, that means action paths are changed, right? So either something stops or it moves or it changes direction. And what we know is that all these cognitive agents, these very simple basal cognitive agents, sometimes what is even considered inorganic matter. So these things that are in nature one, they're not separated the way we are, let's say. They take actions based on some kind of evaluation, right? And this is always imperfect. It can never match the actual, the real, the Alethic truth. And so what's interesting is that this gap between this, what I want to say is that all agents, all life has this problem of having to use its agentic powers based upon an illusion. There's always a gap. And I think reinstating it this way then says, so then what do we do? What is the gap for? How can we turn that into an innovative opportunity? Like all this other stuff is a real problem, don't get me wrong, but somehow in here there's like a little gem of why is that in the system in the first place? So that's what I thought of while you guys were, talking, and when those two things, when you reminded us of nature one. So I think there's an opportunity somewhere in there to ask those questions, maybe in a profitable way, if that makes sense. Thank you.
That's awesome.
Thank you for
I love it. Yeah. Thank you, Bonnie. Yeah. I mean, these are mysterious questions, right? I mean, yes, there always is a gap, and I think there always will be a gap in a sense. And I think the idea of Alethic resonance is like that maybe we can sort of asymptotically start to like, and it's not like a perfect one-to-one, but it's like starting to come into resonance, right? It's like we're not just singing some crazy note here while there's a whole symphony playing here. It's like we're tuned in to what the symphony is playing, and we're doing our best to kind of go in. And I don't know, like cosmically, it's like, why is there a gap? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's part of the beauty of what is unfolding here on this planet in terms of like this nature two thing being a part of this unity that's able to reflect on itself and do all kinds of wildly creative things. And if there wasn't a gap there, that wouldn't be possible. And so, I think that's part of what makes life really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if there wasn't a gap, there's no room to grow. I mean, we live in a moving, becoming universe. So
yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, that's just I wanted to share that. And I think it talked a little bit about what Mark was saying, in terms of, but it didn't problematize Bhaskar's work.
Could I just say that the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty is incredibly relevant to all of this, his concept of chiasm.
For sure.
And it's one of the most beautiful philosophies there is, vastly underestimated, and I think it's absolutely relevant to some of these topics.
Yeah, and just like one last follow-up there, Bonnie, on your point, it's like, I mean, the idea of the eudaimonistic society for me is not like we've reached some kind of ultimate static omega and like everything's great now. It's more like collectively we get really good at being in that sort of dynamic processual planetary dance where it is starting to approach it asymptotically, but the thing is it's always a receding horizon because life just keeps unfolding and new dynamics and complex patterns are emerging, and we're constantly surfing that wave. But you could envision a society that collectively gets a lot better than we currently are at doing that.
Yeah, and I think that in terms of caring, I forgot how you introduced it, but it's like there's something very bittersweet about noticing, a flower trying to grow in in the road, let's say, what it wants to become. This is poetic license, but there's a gap between what it wants to become and just noticing this is like it's a meta contemplation on compassion, that the beauty is in the fact that there's this space of resonance, and yet there's a struggle, right? There's a struggle from a certain perspective. I just think it's kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's an important point that we're not trying to resolve that tension. We're just getting better at how to wield it.
Yeah, and to understand. Yeah, to understand like the recipe for flourishing, given that that's it. I'm gonna go off into like metaphysics. I don't want to be metaphysical, but yeah, thanks for letting me speak.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate all the dialogue and questions, and appreciate you all.
Appreciate you, Nick. Thank you very much. Godspeed. And this, I think, well, I guess I introduce, so I'll just do a quick outro here as well, which is, I think your work represents a really seminal kind of pioneering effort to do the sorts of work that we're trying to continue in the Institute, and bring different models together, do these non-preservative synthesis, bring something more comprehensive from the relative merits and benefits of different models into something that's even more complete and more helpful, hopefully, for addressing the metacrisis. So you're an indispensable part of the team, and your vision that you bring to this whole project is essential. So thanks for all of that, and thanks for this awesome presentation, and thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, everybody.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.